Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with Ask Dave. The question is from a listener, and it's a very good question. What is the difference between a symphony and a concerto for orchestra? That's actually a profound question, because there are many works in the 20th century which are called concerto for orchestra, which are virtually indistinguishable from symphonies. And the definition of symphony as it exists today has become so loose as to render the distinction almost meaningless. But there are certain guidelines we can think about. The most important thing to keep in mind is this. It really depends on what the composer thought about what each genre is. Some composers had a very rigid view of what a symphony is. Others, like Mahler and Nielsen and others who were, experimenting a bit with the form, had a much more open view of what a symphony could be. Shostakovich, the modern symphonists tended to take a much more relaxed view of things. And there is a thing called a symphony concertante, which is a symphony that has a major solo instrument in it, like a concerto. But it's not quite the same thing as a concerto for orchestra, because, as the name implies, the idea is that there is no single soloist, but rather the orchestra itself is an ensemble of soloists. That's the concerto for orchestra principle, but it's also the symphonic principle in the hands. We talk about let me just say, when I talk about Haydn's symphonies, some of them I say are concerto for orchestra symphonies, because they have very, very prominent solos for either individual players or for individual sections of the orchestra. And the handling of the orchestra can be virtuosic in and of itself, even though we're talking about a symphony. So that is a very confusing way to start this answer. And I apologize for that. But our musical history, the way our musical terminology is very loose. And so there's no simple answer. But let me lay out some principles. Having said all of that and totally muddled things, I hope, let me see if I can bring some clarity to the question. First, most people look at symphonies as works in 4 movements or sections: an opening quick movement, a slow movement, a dance movement, a scherzo or a minuet or a something, or an intermezzo, a lighter movement, and a finale. One movement is normally in standard sonata form, which tells you right away that you're dealing with a symphony, usually, because a symphony is the orchestral version of the sonata as it evolved, and the sonata style, the sonata form, with a movement that has an exposition with 2 subjects, a development section that diddles the subject, and a recapitulation that restates the subjects in the original home key. That is your sort of sonata form thing. And when you have a movement that does that, you're usually dealing with a symphony. However, concertos do not usually have 4 movements. They usually have 3 movements. And you are also, one of which is in sonata form, but a special concerto version of sonata form, which is completely irrelevant in the concerto for orchestra format, because the concerto version of sonata form necessarily assumes the presence of a distinct single soloist, which you're not going to have in a concerto for orchestra. So that's one place where some confusion arises. But the number of movements is usually is often a giveaway, because a lot of concerti for orchestra do not have 4 symphonic movements. They have 3, like a concerto. So that's one way in which the composer might have made a distinction. Another issue that comes up in the 20th century, because the concerto for orchestra as a name for something is a 20th century phenomenon. The earliest versions were by, Hindemith and Bartók and Kodály, and a couple other people wrote pieces called Concerto for Orchestra, or Concerto for String Orchestra, or Concerto for some ensemble without a regular soloist. There is a fear of symphonies in the postmodern, well, not postmodern, but early 20th century. I don't know what you'd call that period, neoclassical period, whatever it was. There were a lot of composers who were extremely nervous to be compared with the great works by Beethoven, Brahms, and Mendelssohn, and Schumann, and all of those people, and then Bruckner and Mahler. And so they decided that, as Wagner declared, that the symphony was dead, which of course it wasn't, but they didn't want to be compared. It was just nerves. And so a lot of works which really should be called symphonies are nervous works. One of the most famous concerto for orchestra of all is Bartók's. It is a 5-movement symphony. By any definition, it's a 5-movement symphony. The first movement is in standard sonata form with an introduction. Then it has an intermezzo-like movement, and then a slow movement, and then another intermezzo-like movement, and then a rondo finale, and with a fugal interlude. I mean, Beethoven's Eroica Symphony does the same thing as the finale of Bartók's Concerto for Orchestra. So he could have called it a symphony very, very easily. The reason he didn't, and the other thing that may distinguish, not always, but may distinguish a concerto for orchestra, is the tendency to treat groups of instruments soloistically. They each get their star turn. Now, again, many, many symphonies do that too. I mean, if you look at the scherzo of Tchaikovsky's Fourth Symphony, which is a virtuoso piece for only pizzicato strings, the whole string section playing pizzicato the whole time, and then a middle section which is only for the woodwinds and the brass with virtuoso parts for the piccolo. And it's very, very hard to say, well, that wouldn't fit in a concerto for orchestra. It sure as hell would, but Tchaikovsky didn't call it that. In the case of the Bartók, you have, for example, a major fugato thing for the brass section alone. Dum ba da 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 da. That's the tune of the fugato. And one member of the brass section after another, this is in the middle of the first movement, comes out and does that thing. And it's very, very, it's very concerto-like. Let's put it that way, for that group of soloists. In the second movement, which, Bartók called the games of the couples, you have all of the woodwinds in pairs, each playing a melody at different intervals, the seconds, the thirds, the fourths, the fifths. It's a brilliant, brilliant movement that highlights each woodwind. You've got, and trumpets, by the way. It's woodwind and trumpets, just like bassoons, then oboes, then clarinets, then trumpets, then, So, and then it repeats after a brass chorale in the middle. So you've got these sections of the orchestras highlighted. In the slow movement, it's the passionate threnody on the violins for the most part. The second also has the violas and cellos, that Stranger in Paradise kind of tune with the strumming harp. And then the finale is a perpetual motion, a virtuoso perpetual motion for the whole orchestra. The strings wildly, it's very concerto-like. It's concerto-like because of the emphasis on virtuosity, either individually or as a section. So, and Bartók, who wrote a couple of symphonies, if you want to call them that, the music for strings, percussion, and celesta is a symphony, by any definition of the word symphony, just about. There are quite a few pieces like that in the repertoire of the 20th century by composers who wouldn't be caught dead writing a symphony. And that's just, it's not a musical thing. It's a philosophical thing. It's an aesthetic thing. It's a personal thing. But in general, when you hear the word concerto for orchestra, think about the individual solo parts, the parts for each instrument and each section of the orchestra, and how the composer handles them. And you might, as I say, get some sort of sense of the concerto principle in that music. You might not. If you don't hear any difference, you are not wrong. You're really, really not wrong, because it is a classic case, I think, in the world of classical music of a distinction without a difference. It doesn't make any difference. As long as they're using a movement in sonata form, or they have some sort of developmental thing, whether it's a concerto for orchestra or a symphony, it's peh. It's just what the composer felt like saying. So don't sweat it. You're not missing anything. Let me put it to you that way. If you understand, you'll hear the same thing. I mean, that's the point. You hear the same things. Yes, it's a flute solo. Yes, the strings do this. And they do the same thing in symphonies as well. That's about a 10-minute way of saying it doesn't matter. But I wanted to try and explain to you in a way why it doesn't matter and how it doesn't matter. And those few cases where maybe it matters a little, it's not a big deal. Not a big deal at all. So I hope this answers your question. Thank you for asking it. Keep on listening and take care.